Hey guys, Mark Allen, BH Spring Solutions LLC and BHSpringSolutions.com, and today we are explaining the technical side of the benefits and the first time design components in a trigger subassembly for the high power pistol. And this video is actually going to double as also our documentation of the specific design elements of this trigger subassembly, for which we believe that a patent is justified and warranted. And the first thing that we believe is a very clear patent-worthy thing that we have done here is the magazine eject assist spring. This is entirely BH Spring Solutions and RDIH conceived and designed and perfected. Specifically, the wording that that goes with that is it's a magazine eject assist spring for use in Browning high power pistols and all high power clones. When used and only usable in conjunction with the BH Spring Solutions trigger pawl, trigger return spring combination of the advanced trigger subassembly for high power pistols. So this is a component that we know we just don't cross paths with anybody on because it's never existed before, because we thought this up along with our partner RDIH in Belgium. And so this is the first element of the design and the technical benefits of the design. Further, and I'm just going to read to you how this will read as far as the intellectual property right design, specific design elements. What this is the new trigger subassembly. It is a trigger pawl, trigger return spring. Now, these three in combination, these three words in combination, these were first seen in a patent application that was approved February 22nd, 1927, and this was for John Browning's automatic pistol, originally filed in 1923, and where he got a design patent for a trigger pawl, trigger return spring that went into that handgun, and functionally was similar to what we're looking at today. It was from that design that BHAdvanced designed the High Power's original trigger subassembly. So to this point, just stating trigger pawl, and trigger return spring mounted in the frame of a high-power design handgun. This really is the generic of what John Browning received a patent for in 1927. That trigger subassembly, specifically, that patent was designed where the pivot point was not a pin. This trigger that he designed had arms that came out on each side, and they mounted, and the trigger rotated on its own pin, basically, or its own arms, so to say. So this is the point where we will depart from John Browning's design. So trigger pawl, and trigger return spring mounted in the frame of a high-power design handgun with a pin inserted through the frame and trigger. Now we cross paths with the Browning High Power's original trigger design for the P35, and that was BHAdvanced's rework of John Browning's original trigger pawl changed to a trigger lever and trigger return spring design. So this is where our design does cross paths with John Browning and with BHAdvanced and the standard trigger in the FN, but this is the last place that it crosses paths, because now everything gets different. So reading again, trigger pawl, trigger return spring mounted in the frame of a high-power design handgun with a pin inserted through the frame and trigger, containing a trigger pawl mounted from the rear of the trigger after introduction into the frame. And what that is talking about is the trigger pawl with this design, after the trigger is in the frame, it is mounted from the rear, as you just saw, and in that way, just as simply as you saw it, it becomes mounted, and without the use of a pin. in order to hold that trigger lever or that trigger pawl in place. Mounted from the rear of the trigger after introduction into the frame, designed to enable significant performance adjustment capability through the use of multiple trigger return springs. And the assembly designed to function with a broad range of spring strengths so as to enable regulation of trigger brake weights by plus or minus 2 pounds approximately, and designed for use with a magazine ejection assist spring, but is fully functional without the use of a magazine eject assist spring. And what I've done is I've just given you the long version of what this product is, what we have done, and the kind of the technical secret, if you will, to how it is that we have enabled multiple spring strengths. And it really comes down to a design element of the original P35 trigger, and I have one of those in my hand. I've grabbed an old gold-plated version, so it'd be kind of easy to see what we're talking about. This particular design, I want to show you what happens. Put the trigger pin through the right direction. This hole where the trigger pin you see going into is in extremely close proximity to the trigger return spring. In fact, it's in such close proximity that here in the hole, you'll see it rising through the hole right there. And it's just below the bottom of the outside part of the hole. And what we see happen is this, we introduce the trigger pin like we do. And by the way, FN always expected this trigger return spring in their design to contact the trigger. It's why they grooved out the trigger pin right here, was to give themselves more margin. That's not to keep the trigger pin in the handgun. That's really no big problem. What happens is this, and I'm going to just demonstrate it for you. That tolerance between that spring and the bottom of this pin, which you can't see after you have installed this, the tolerance there is like threading a needle. It really gets in the way of, and I want to show you this. Now we have the trigger pin is here, and the trigger lever is installed as it would be if it was in the handgun, and I have a trigger pin that no longer leaves the trigger. The reason is because this pressure by the trigger lever has caused that underside of that spring to contact the pin. So now you can have this just wonderfully excellent relationship here with your trigger pin and the trigger. In fact, I mean, as you see, it just falls out. The problem comes in and starts to come in when the trigger lever is installed. And FN knew this. They would not have ever grooved out that trigger pin if they had not been aware that they were going to be having contact with this spring. And I think they knew it was a downside. And now when you see in the regular install position, that trigger pin is being held in the trigger by the pressure of nothing but that trigger return spring. And it causes resistance on the trigger. It also causes a real limitation on the diameter of spring wire, and that came out because I just released some of the pressure on the trigger pin. But here, the trigger lever is still installed, and the trigger lever you see is forward, and you see that spring right there. Obviously, it's going to be contacting. This pin is stationary in the handgun, so we're asking the trigger to move on a stationary pin, and we always have this possibility at some level we're always going to have some kind of contact there, and we'll see what I mean here. Like this, you know, that trigger pin is going nowhere. In fact, I mean, there's all kinds of resistance that is created. The trigger return springs that we find most common in Browning high powers that are functional are a 0.9 diameter spring wire and a 0.8 diameter, 0.8 millimeter diameter spring wire. And you have very little range as far as what is usable in this combination. So now we're going to go ahead and drop the trigger lever back out here, and we'll depressurize, and the pin just now comes right out. So that was a limitation of the original, and it still is. It's been a limitation for 85 years now, in terms of, you know, working with this design. The design itself is made with the magazine disconnect in place. It's kind of a catch-22 situation, and I'll explain to you what I mean. Is we have two springs competing against each other for the positioning of the trigger lever. And you see when I push on the magazine disconnect, the trigger lever is allowed to come to the, or is forced to the rear, and then the magazine disconnect spring wins out on the competition when the magazine is taken out of the pistol and the trigger lever then comes back forward. This is positioning of a part by two competing springs, and the downside of that is I've got a brand new 26-year-old, but brand new. It's never been fired or detail stripped whatsoever. And I think I've got a good example for you of what happens. This is 26-year-old, quote, brand new handgun. It has the original trigger inside, but I want to show you what has started to happen. See the positioning of our trigger lever right there? We're just starting to get hints of these springs aren't doing their job anymore. You see the trigger lever's not fully rearward in its slot. Now I pulled it and it moved there. There you see it finishes out halfway. This should position positively with the magazine out. It should position positively here, just like you see it right there. And of course, when the magazine is put in, it should go to the rear, and it still does. However, we're starting to see the age of those springs starting to show, and we're starting to show the reliability of the positioning of that trigger lever, in fact, starting to go away. I can feel more resistance on this trigger when the magazine is out, not because of the magazine disconnect is not rubbing against the magazine, although that's part of it, but I feel this very unnatural kind of resistance at that point. That is that trigger return spring pressing upwards on the bottom of that pin, and actually the trigger gets a little lighter ironically, sort of. We got the magazine disconnect pressing against the magazine housing now. So this, the original high powers trigger subassembly, it had these downsides, along with being positioned forward and with this upward slope, so that it's really a down and back trigger pull. You look at the distance at the bottom of my trigger finger here, and watch it close in on the bottom of the trigger guard here, and you just saw it as I pulled rearward. My bottom of my trigger finger, yep, it does. It gets closer. It's down and back. So that was another thing that we wanted to take care of in the redesign of this trigger. The trigger return spring itself is a redesign, and specifically for this trigger. We believe it has a lot of attributes to John Browning's first trigger return spring in the 1927 Grand Regiment, but because of frame changes, there's no way to make it like he would have designed it then, because the frame that where this area lives, specifically where this part of the spring engages in the frame, the area there in the frame is completely different than what he would have designed. But now I want to show you a difference here, and this is a biggie difference. Do you see all of that massive amount of room under the trigger pin? You see the trigger return spring is here, and there's no pressure on that trigger pin. We're going to go ahead and insert it in along with our trigger lever, so you can see it with a little upward pressure on it, and that there's still just all kinds of margin for this. There we go. What I'm wanting to show you here is right underneath the trigger pin here. We still have all kinds of margin, even if I lift up on this part of the pin. And now we're all pressurized everywhere. The trigger pin is still very, very free. That trigger return spring has got easy a couple millimeters of margin between the pinhole where the pin goes and where that trigger return spring is. That is completely different. It is what allows us to have as many as, well, so far 4 different trigger return springs, and each of these will be about 1/2 to 3/4 of a pound difference in your trigger break weight as measured on a trigger scale. This is a completely new thing for high power pistols that's never existed before. It did not exist as a feature or a design element in John Browning's original trigger design for the 1927 Grand Regiment. It is design impossible to have 4 different trigger return springs of different varying diameters in the original trigger subassembly. You can see how little margin there is between that pin and the spring right there. These are always going to be working each other, even in a best day scenario. The essence of what has happened with this new trigger subassembly is we've gotten this trigger pin out of the way. The trigger return spring focuses on doing exactly what it does, and it keeps the positioning of the trigger lever rearward, and the forces of that spring are able to focus 100% not on overcoming resistance with its own trigger pin, but the force is able to be applied to the rear of the trigger to reset the trigger, and 100% of the spring's force can be used to reset the trigger. That's the reason why we get a very acceptable trigger return action with even our lightest 0.65 trigger return spring, and you get moderate return action with the magazine disconnect out with a 0.8 or our light trigger return spring, 3-coil trigger return spring in the OEM original trigger subassembly. You get, it's okay reset. You get better reset with our even lighter spring with a 0.15 millimeters less diameter of spring wire. You'll get better reset with this because, again, all the forces of this spring are able to are being directed to doing what the spring was designed to do, and none of the influence of the spring is being bound up by the relationship with the trigger pin. So these are the design elements that have been changed. The entire trigger itself is different. You can see how it positions inside the trigger guard area. It's a much more pure, much more straight back kind of a trigger pull. It does have some function elements that John Browning described in the 1927 Grand Regiment. You do feel just a little bit more resistance as you get back to the point we call the wall, so to say, and that is just about right there. And then we have a clean break, and that is the total trigger travel. There's literally, with this particular handgun, this is a Type 2 sear lever high power. There's no over travel past that point, and I measured that, and that comes out to basically measured with a caliper, putting a caliper here, a caliper on the trigger, noting the distance, and then tightening the caliper until the hammer falls. And I measured 3.7 millimeters was the total distance of the trigger travel, and we believe that that is somewhere much less than the total trigger travel of the original high powers trigger design as well, and so that is another improvement. But this is essentially been some of the more technical aspects, and specifically the design aspects that BH Spring Solutions believes are patent-worthy design elements of this the BH Spring Solutions advanced trigger subassembly with magazine eject assist for high power pistols.